Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today we're going to go through just a quick OPEC update and something that we haven't done but we'd like to do now. So we did a bigger write-up on Iran. We've done several write-ups on Iran overall, and we provided a little bit of a update now that we've seen some. Obviously the nuclear scientist was killed. What does it mean, and what are we expecting going into 2021 with a President Biden coming in, an Iranian election that's supposed to happen in June of next year, and what does that mean for essentially exports coming out of Iran in general? So please reach out. Love to send you the free sample. I think it's only a page and a half, so it's not crazy. And just if you'd like to learn more, when we do some of these geopolitical meets oil demand, or just in general, just because why it's important to look at not only supply countries but demand countries, which is why we talk so much about China. But so please reach out if you'd like that free sample, or I should say free report. And then obviously we have our end of year report, which if you please reach out if you'd like the table of contents and a sample to see if that is right for you. And then before we get started, please like, share, subscribe. Your support is appreciated. So now just we've cleared all that up. We can look at the OPEC crude oil production. Now this is just based on direct communication, the secondary sources, because it's a little bit better to look at this versus direct communication, which can always be a little interesting in terms of what they actually report. So here you can see what November was. As we talked about it in our other OPEC show, we see it at about north of 25 million barrels, and the gain is really driven based on Libya. So you can see from October of 453 to November of the increases. Now, it's important to highlight that the success of the OPEC deal, as we want to call it that, just because there's so much cheating that has gone on over that same time period, which is something that we talk about in a different report, you can see that here Libya was, and the fall of Libya, Iran, and Venezuela was very supportive of some of these flows. And now that we have Libya coming back to the market, you can see that the net change was 707,000 barrels a day, and that was really driven by Libya. And now, given what we're seeing in December so far is, you can see that in November they hit 1.1. We're seeing them be able to hit about 1.2. So again, we've realized some of those gains, but as we go into January, that's when we're going to get an additional increase of 500,000 barrels. And by additional, I just mean that some of the cheating that has gone on through November, through December, is now starting to kind of flatten back out. We have a net about 100 million barrels that has come to market that wasn't supposed to. If you look at net cheating, some of that has been made up for, specifically on the UAE side, but on a net level, there was about 100 million barrels that wasn't supposed to be in the market get to market. So you could say that that's bullish because 100 million barrels was absorbed. But at the same time, you can say that, okay, well, now as we go into January, and the 500,000 barrels that was being pushed into the market is now okay, do they start to go above that again? And then all of a sudden they kind of preempt the next increase. And so then instead of it being 500,000 barrel increase that month, it's really from the previous month, and it keeps kind of capitulating overall and getting these growths, which is going to be an inherent problem as we still sit in a very uncertain demand level. And we still see the U.S. staying fairly stable. Growth is going to be difficult at the current juncture, but we will see a fairly stable output in terms of crude. And condensate condensate and liquids will see an increase, but oil will stay fairly flat. Libya's obviously been recognized, but Brazil is going to see additional FPSOs show up, which is going to put additional crude into the market. Norway has a additional basin, or I shouldn't say another basin, another site of the basin coming on, which will increase the amount that they can put into the market. So we do have some increases in just inherent oil flow with Guyana starting to ramp back up. And then the question is going to be, when does Suriname start to turn on? Do we start to develop that? What does that look like overall? Because that will take time. Iran is another interesting one because they do talk about increasing their total flow of oil into the market, but we'll go through some of those specifics in a few slides. So this is just looking at world oil demand. As we've been saying, people are going to come closer to our number, which we talk about in our reports. But here you can see just in terms of what we're seeing. So for 2020, they've taken down their estimates. Now they're expecting about 90 million barrels of total oil demand. Q4 has been reduced again. That will most likely get reduced one more time, or I should say a few more times, because sometimes they'll continue to go back and kind of adjust. And the reason why is because of Europe and the US. So why do we keep talking about these two areas? Because you can say, well, other areas aren't seeing the same type of pressure from COVID. And the reason is because they are huge demand drivers on an aggregate. So when we look at the US, obviously Europe isn't as big, but the US continues to be a massive driving country just based on how spread out things are, specifically in the Midwest, the West Coast, and parts of the South and Southeast. So because of that, we will see the most amount of driving in the U.S. And as we see some of those oil demand, gasoline demand numbers come down, that again will slow down total oil demand because we're not going to see the same type of ramp up in refinery utilization that we normally see, which is just going to put pressure on what Q4 is going to look like, especially as some of those GDP numbers get revised lower, specifically out of Europe. Then when we look at world oil demand going forward, you can see Q1, they took it down by about 1 million barrels, and they've normalized essentially Q1, Q2, which speaks to the pressure that we continue to see into that refined product demand issue. And we keep talking about refined products because you need to clear that in order to free up capacity to increase runs, to get some of the spreads. We have seen refined crack spreads get a little bit better in Asia. We're starting to see some positive numbers come back through, which will start to accelerate some of the capacity, but not a whole lot, just because we still have a lot in storage and they're going to have to clear that. So crack spreads have started to get a little bit better, but understand they normally get a little bit better this time of year. So you have to seasonally adjust that, which kind of mutes some of the increases, but again, still something positive to see at least. The issue is going to be Q1, in my opinion, because that's going to set the stage for, what are we going to look at as we go into the end of the year. How quickly can we get the vaccine rolled out? We've seen, Pfizer cut 2020 estimates of deliveries in half. Will we see the same type of slowdown in Q1? Because it's just difficult to not only make it logistically, getting into all the different regions. Will different areas get the allotted amount that they need, or will they not have enough for specific areas? So we'll start to see people, essentially slow down. So we still think that 95 million barrels a day of demand is still high for Q1. We're a bit lower, just given where we see some of the pressures as we head out of December and into January, especially as we keep talking about stimulus in the U.S. and we started with 2.5 trillion, then it became 1.9 trillion, and now we're talking about 900 billion. And again, there's only so much you can do without seeing the same type of turn on the consumer side, job side, which is going to continue to weigh on the different pieces. So Chinese crude imports averaged 10 million barrels in October, falling below the 11 million. But we did see that increase, as we talked about in the end of the EIA show, where we did get some of that increase. So the decline came. And we're just looking overall at where are we seeing some of the backdrops, because Golden Week holiday saw a pause, and now we're trying to see, are we going to see something similar in the Lunar New Year? Because when we look back, that is kind of historically what we normally see. And that's why, as we talked about in the end of, in segment 3 of the EIA show, some of that wheat in terms of teapot activity, refined product builds that are going to continue to kind of weigh on where some of that demand is going to be. So that's why we want to look a little bit deeper at, okay, well, what is Chinese oil demand overall? So when we take some of the commentary that we have to appreciate that November was an increase. So some of this did get normalized after seeing the slowdown. But LPG is the one I just want to pause on for a moment, because LPG continues to be strong. They have to get it from somewhere, and as we showed in the last week's EIA, and in not only the end of year report, but then a report that came out last week, this is something that is coming from the U.S. It's going to continue. Gasoline slowed down, diesel oil slowed down. These are things that did reverse in November. The question is, we're starting to see some of that softness come back in December, so it'll most likely be better year over year in December, but down month over month, which again is going to be a matter of, well, what does this look like as we head into the end of the year, which is again why we remain concerned on January, because a lot of that initial demand is some of the startups of these refiners. And then are we going to see some of these builds? And as the builds increase, then you're going to have to see teapot refinery utilization rates fall back to some of those normal levels. And are we going to just see some of the state-owned facilities, hold at that 75% level? On-road passenger traffic shrunk 36.6% year over year in October, compared to a 38.2% drop in September. And this is something, when we're looking at that year over year move, this is where we have to kind of separate the data points, because we had a drop in on-road passenger traffic, as while passenger car sales posted an increase of 9.8% year over year, following an increase of 8.6% year over year in September. So we are getting more car sales, but we're not seeing that translate into on traffic. Now, some of that has normalized in November into December, but we're starting to see some of that slow back down. Again, some of that trending that is going to be problematic as we look at China as kind of this saving grace in terms of just where are they going to be on the demand side. Now, as we look at some of the geopolitical risk, we had another attack on a Saudi vessel. It was carrying refined products. It had an explosion. The assessment is that it was a mine or some sort of damage to the outside. So ship was hit by an explosion in Jeddah. And there were no casualties. There were no real issues. Again, I should say issues in terms of environmental. Most of this was kept fairly stable. But again, increase in geopolitical risk, an increase in some of the fears that, what is happening in Yemen? Is this some of the last hurrah? Again, coming back to what we've been talking about with Iran, as they lose support and or influence within the Shia Crescent. Is this them kind of lashing out to try to show that they're still relevant? The problem is it costs money to do that, and they have a huge economic problem. Economic problem being sanctions continue to bite. So the tankertrackers.com are saying that based on the satellite imagery they're seeing, they're estimating Iranian crude oil exports hit about 1.2 million barrels a day, up from 481,000 barrels a day in February. So they need money. That's as simple as that. I know I'm stating the obvious, but they need money and they need it now. And the question, how do you do it? You don't piss people off. You don't make people angry by blowing stuff up, increasing your aggression towards some of these regions. You try to pull back and try to sneak some of this crude out or sell it at a steeper discount just to get capital in and sending more to China. So we will see some of these increases, especially as they look to, obviously crude prices have gone up. So as crude prices rally, if they give a bigger discount, they're still going to capture more. So it makes sense to do it now versus in other periods, which is why we think that Tanker Trackers is correct. We will see an additional increase, and we'll probably get closer to about 1.4 million barrels. There is a certain logistical issue trying to hide from sanctions. So it's not like they can get right back to normal, but there is a certain amount of flexibility to increase. And then the question is going to be, what do sanctions look like as we head into a Biden presidency, which is something that we talk about. Now, as we just kind of looking at the different backdrops before we get into the OECD data, I just kind of want to reiterate some of the facts that we've seen. So China set a record for daily crude oil processing for a second straight month as plants utilized new capacity and refiners boosted runs. Crude processing was at 58.35 million tons in November. That's an equivalent to about 14.26 million barrels, which we talked about in the third segment of the EIA show. The previous record was set in October, again, which is what we're seeing now. The issue is China's gotten better. November was a record, but we are seeing bigger builds so far in December in refined products, which is kind of offsetting some of that demand, where we're seeing increase in oil demand, but an increase in refined product storage and a rising increase in December exports. Again, offsetting, because where is that going to hurt? Well, South Korea crude imports fell to 9.3 million tons in November, which is down 25% from a year earlier. And that's the least since June 2010. To give you an idea of, okay, well, China's increasing, which means somebody's going to have to decrease, because you're going to have an increase in amount of refined product on the water. So this is going to take market share, which, again, China wants to take market share. So it's not like this isn't their goal, but it doesn't mean that everybody's going to maintain the same oil throughput. If somebody's going to back off, especially as we get an increase in refined products, which we continue to see in Singapore, Fujairah, US, Europe, in terms of some of these storage levels, which is going to be a concern. And then that's why we have to look at where some of this flow is, which is why when we look at the EU 15 plus Norway total oil stocks, you can see that we typically get a drop in from August to let's just call it October. Instead, the pace of declines is slowed down considerably, and we still hold at this elevated level well above the 5-year average. Now, when we look at lockdowns, when we look at Norway increasing their throughput, or I should say loading schedule, as we see storage levels on the water remain elevated, we got another increase in November of oil stocks, again, which is why it's not a lot. It's 370,000 barrels, but again, we're just going flat instead of coming back to where we need to see, and this is going to be pressured on, the Saudis, and I shouldn't say just Saudi, UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq all cut OSPs into the U.S. and into Europe. Where is that going to go? So the IEA expects the crude glut left behind. They're saying that 625 million barrels is going to clear by the end of the year, as demand is clearly going to be lower for longer than expected. Something that we've been saying, where we do think demand is going to remain a problem, not just into Q1 of next year, but into Q2 of next year. And now we talked about the OPEC reducing their demand numbers. The IEA reduced demand growth in 2021 by 110,000 barrels a day because of sustained pressure in jet fuel and kerosene, which, as we've been talking about. But they do see a jump overall in terms of consumption. The question is going to be, how quickly do we get distillate and gasoline really starting to go back up, just because, as we talked about on our econ show, we remain concerned on GDP growth. And if we look at GDP growth as driven by the consumer, as driven by investment, that's where we don't see the same type of robust nature, because a lot of people and companies used COVID as a means of letting people go, and it doesn't mean they're going to quickly hire them back, which again is going to be a bigger issue over time, as the glut left behind is going to be about 625 million barrels into the end of the year based on IEA data, which, as you can see here, is well above where they should be if we look at the EU, European Union 15. Now, when we look at total OECD commercial oil stocks, you can see that they still remain far above where they should be at this time of year. And as we see some of the slowdowns, not only in the US, but in Europe, again, the pace of decline isn't really coming fast enough to bring us back into the top end of the range as we head into the end of December, and then as we set up for January, which is, again, some of the other issues that OPEC keeps talking about, where they're increasing production. Libya is now back and active, and where are we going to see as we head into the end of the year? Excuse me. Now, when we look at what's happening with Saudi, so Saudi crude exports to most major Asian nations surged in the first half. You can see the increases in December so far. China, India, Japan, South Korea. South Korea, as we talked about, has fallen off, but the increases have been substantial into the first three. Now, this is above kind of where they should be based on what their production numbers are. So this is why we keep talking about they're selling out of storage. So they're getting floating storage will come down, and they do have the ability to sell from onshore storage because they do have that capacity. So they're going to try to take advantage of. People are still going to buy it in the with the OSPs going up. This is something that they're going to be happy to fill in. Now, this is through the first half. The question is going to be, will that maintain through the end of the year, or are they trying to buy as much as they can ahead of time? And then they're going to essentially drop off. And what we're seeing so far, now that we're getting closer to the second half, is we are seeing that slowdown. And the slowdown is really being driven based on when we look at Dubai spreads. You can see that into backwardation after China and India crude buying. We did get a spike. Some of this will normalize. We're not saying it comes below zero again, but again, you're starting to see some of the, as we saw the big spike, now we're starting to see some of that slowdown, which as we see some of that cooling and some of the pricing normalizing as we come into the end of the year. And we still think that January is going to be fairly tough when we look at it from an aggregate of crude oil supply, crude oil and refined product storage, just given kind of where the levels sit, not only in China, but also in OECD nations, as we just haven't seen that drawdown. And this is with OSPs being fairly strong into these areas and pushing crude into other regions, which we've had almost 1 billion barrels of missing crude. Which just means that it's gone into storage that isn't as easily tracked. So not only do we have an increase in the amount of OECD oil in storage, but we also have an increase of about 980 million barrels in other regions, including India and China. So again, these are things that kind of give pause, especially as we get into the first quarter of next year, and we see some of the pressure in refined products, maintaining through the end of the year. So if you have any questions, any comments, please leave them in the comment section. We love the back and forth. Again, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.